Hey y'all, Flex Chapman here. And before I give any thoughts on Diablo or anything surrounding it, I want to make sure I give a bit of context to everything that I'm going to be saying. Diablo 4, for reasons I can't explain, really piqued my interest. Enough so that I pre-ordered the deluxe edition, I missed the first week of the beta, and I still got each character to max level in the second pass with enough time to test them, excluding Rogue, but we'll get into that. Despite that, I am extremely new to ARPGs. I haven't played a single Diablo game before 4's beta, and my only ARPG experience was Lost Ark, and I'm not sure that really counts. I also played its primary competitor, Path of Exile, for about 30 to 40-ish hours now, all in a short time frame, however, and I just wanted to get a firm idea of what people are comparing Diablo to in today's market and how an ARPG should feel. The purpose of this video is to give a relatively unbiased opinion on a game that I had very little experience with, so I can give an accurate assessment into how it truly feels and plays as a new player, while also showing what it looks like and feels like as somebody who played through it on all characters. I want to discuss the atmosphere, including the level design, map design, and the soundtrack. I want to make sure I review the questing experience and dungeon experience, and I have a lot to say about those. I also want to dig deeply into the character design, not too deeply as in statistics and numbers, but just overall my experience, and I'm going to be looking at it from the aspect of class fantasy, strengths and weaknesses, the fun of playing it, and eventually the choice I'm going to be making on release. Finally, I want to give the whole game a rating of review and talk about the entire experience of the game and beta as a whole. All of these reasons have proven to me that it's going to be a mainstay in my content for the next foreseeable future when it releases, but that's something that I think you'll be able to put together when you get to the end of this. So let's get started. This should be a quick segment, but one I would feel wholly unjust if I didn't touch upon at least a little. The work that went into creating such a visceral and projecting environment definitely deserves its props when it comes to Diablo 4. The cold places feel cold, and they look cold. The gross places feel gross and vile, and they make you want to avoid them. The towns give a sense of purpose to all the little areas you can explore, and the overworld seems to change its vibe differently every minute you're walking around. The little pop-up fights are really interesting, if not a little repetitive, but it's a blast to nuke one that used to give you trouble. That doesn't include treasure goblins, the butcher, and all the little things scattered everywhere, and we're going to talk about those later. As someone who loves mindless MMO tasks, I did appreciate the mining, the herbing, and all the other little small resource grabs, and that they were super easy, just one click to do it. The map was relatively large in the beta, and it's only going to get so much larger on its release. The soundtracks fit the theme in each place I visited so well. I want to give absolute props to the design. Each place felt awesome, except for the boss fights a little bit, but that's me personally. Now, I do want to admit there were some jarringly loud noises at random times when patrolling and running dungeons. All in all, I'd like to say that I have zero complaints from this aspect. Blizzard did what they do best in creating a functioning, thematic world. Well, at least a thematic world, but this one does function, and I'd give the overall atmosphere a 9.5 out of 10. Side note, from a non-ARPG player standpoint, the movement and abilities were very natural feeling. Surprisingly, the ability keyboards felt odd to me, especially since they were locked until level 7, which didn't really make any sense, but once I hit 7, I was QWER with main click as my generator, and right click being just my movement. There's a method to the madness, and I'd give the newcomer playstyle comfort of 8.5 out of 10. I think anybody can pretty much walk into this game, understand the basics, and know what they're doing. For this portion of the video, I'd like to break it down into two separate parts. One about the questing and one about the dungeon design. And for both, I'd like to present what things I felt were good and what things I didn't like and or appreciate. For the questing, I'm basing my overall aptitude and opinion on the questing from two things: my knowledge from other MMOs and quests, such as World of Warcraft, Lost Ark, and others, as well as my recent playthrough of its competitor, Path of Exile. I'll also be judging it based on how it feels baseline from playing as a new player, as well as how it feels as someone who played it 5 times over in the course of 3 days. Without further ado, let's get right into that. For starters, let's look at the main story. One of the better quest lines I've played in a while, and if you're efficient, you can breeze through it. It almost feels recommended to do so since each character feels stronger in their first 10 levels than the next 15 and beyond. I'm sure that when the game releases and there's skill-gated content at the level gaps, this problem's going to fix itself by means of needing to grind alternate content to get to that skill gate, but we'll see that when the game releases. I think the quests themselves, including the lore and pathing, were excellent. The story was well thought out, the cutscenes were unreal and graphically beautiful. I even watched them the first 2 times around, and including my playthroughs with my friends because I wanted them to see how cool they were. The characters get you involved in their story and you feel like you're impacting your surroundings. The main quest also involves some incredible and challenging fights at the end of the larger portions, which felt difficult but always accomplishable with timing and patience. All of this was playing on veteran, so it might be harder on higher difficulties, but I personally like it where it was at. I think that there was something from Lost Ark that I carried with me into this game, which was that Lost Ark incentivized dodging, rolling, and moving a lot to stay out of the boss damage. When I looked at gameplay of older Diablo games, it seemed like a lot of it was more based on your build, movement movement was important, but not as important as it seems to be in this game when you're jumping around very rapidly. I thought there wasn't too much fluff, like quests that you'd have to run here to do something unnecessary to fill all the time. Those quests definitely existed, but they were optional, and I'm going to talk about that a bit more. The main story was really inviting and cool, but I'm curious upon release if it'll be the optimal path, considering there were 3 of them given at the time of the beta, but only 1 that was actually doable. Some things I didn't really like about them included the travel distance, but that might be me being cranky from the repetition. This should be fixed with the inclusion of mounts and also further waypoints. Some quests were really long internally, making it feel like they were intentionally wasting time at points. It's like they were leaning into more maze gameplay and less into unique boss fights with mechanics other than pools and AoE spray. Overall, the side quests in this game were mostly positive as well. Most of them were quick and naturally fell on the path of the main story and related areas, which made them easy to complete. The side quests also progressed incrementally, meaning that if you stopped back at town, the one person you helped at your last visit now has something further or newer in that same chain, and that added to the lore and overall enjoyment of doing them. They ended usually offering unique rewards, and I think that once they're more valuable, because the game's not going to be shoveling loot out, that it's going to feel more rewarding to do those. Even when they weren't directly related to the main story quest, they felt like they were part of the main story. Additionally, the side quests often tied to nearby dungeons, which incentivized cross-progression in a zone, and provided additional things to do in dungeons, which was sorely needed at times. Although they were entirely optional, side quests didn't have any bearing on the completion of the main story quest. That would be fine, but I would say some side quests did require too much dialogue and had players traversing the entire chunk of the map just for a small little sentence. Also, they were not very clear on what needed to be done or where, making tracking them a real headache when the thing that you're farming is a drop not specified or something in that ballpark. Finally, some quests wouldn't load where you were tracking them. Again, these are optional quests and we were in the beta, but I want to make sure I'm doing my diligence in poking holes where I can. Questing as a whole was a blast, even for 5 different characters. Overall, I'd give the questing design an 8.8 out of 10. It hits the mark, but it has a few pinch points I can't exactly gloss over, considering some of the larger ones we'll be getting to. Now, when we pivot over to dungeon design, there's a few angles to approach my thoughts on it, and I think a great place to start is how they feel as a newcomer. I think that the dungeons are designed well with an awesome attention to detail, and thematically, they looked pretty great. Overall, the speed of completion seemed to be decent, as in it felt like the start to finish on most characters was about 10 to 15 minutes, which is expected, and a nice little insert into a quick gaming session. I feel like the loot incentives throughout, including optional chest fights, random battle to the death pylons, loot goblins, and even the butcher, make the game feel dynamic in different dungeons, and the semi-randomized pathing also felt like it gave enough difference most of the time to not feel stale. There's no better time than now to discuss events like loot goblins and the butcher, so I'd like to start off by saying I think they were fantastic, incredibly random, and a really welcome surprise. The loot goblins were a true challenge because often you chased them down a passageway for the chance at something really unique and rewarding, but you'd have to run through 5 or 6 mobs to get to it. The butcher was cool, but felt like it was mostly unnecessary at lower levels. It was a redeeming feeling though, getting revenge later on if you were able to. During the beta, I only beat him with my Necromancer and Sorcerer, but all in all, I think it's a great addition. Now, on the other side of dungeons, you have some traits that I wasn't too happy about. For starters, there was a lot of things that felt like they just wasted time. Endless feeling paths into nothing special. Kill an entire dungeon worth of mobs to continue. All of this seemed like it was intended to make runs last longer, and hopefully will cease to be a problem when the gear scales high enough to just burn through them. They also had repetitive map design, so by the 3rd or 4th run of some dungeons, it felt more like a slog than it did a challenge. In addition, some runs felt less satisfying because there just wasn't a boss. You eventually killed all the trash and got a bell that you finished. Lastly, without digging into classes too deeply yet, each dungeon felt miserable as melee. Boss fights were a rapid dash attempt to conserve HP, while barely scraping by to get a few CDs off, all because the boss would spawn pools of go fuck yourself everywhere while standing in one at all times. Not to mention shooting missiles. When playing ranged, I felt like I could simply obliterate the boss with minimal fear of my safety. Class balance and dungeon balance are 2 different things, but it would be nice if melee just did more damage to compensate for that risk. Overall, dungeons and their design get a 7.9 out of 10. I think they do the job, but I fear that if the endgame is compromised of mostly this, it won't feel good to play this too much in the long run. I, however, believe that we're only in a snapshot view, and that line of thinking's too narrow with the little information we have now. So far, I'm really impressed with the game, but that all gets a shift in perspective when we get to the meat and potatoes, the classes. Over the course of the beta, I played each character up to level 25 except Rogue, who I was only able to get to level 21, and I tested them with as many legendaries as I could get for them while they were at max. I want to look at each of these characters from a few particular angles. 1, their class fantasy. Do they play like they're advertised? Do they feel powerful in their class archetypes? 2, their strengths and weaknesses. What felt strongest? What felt lacking? What could be better? And 3, how fun were they to play? As a new player to the game in ARPGs, how did it feel to level with the character and get stronger? And 4, and this is at the end, what I'm going to be choosing. I'm going to be going over these in the order in which I played these characters, so starting off, we're going to go into the Barbarian. Jumping into the first class, we have the one I leveled first, a Barbarian. When I went into Barbarian, I had one simple goal in mind: large hammer, hit hard. That's exactly what I played and built for initially, and it felt pretty good. Class fantasy is absolutely present with the Barbarian, that is until you truly start leveling. See, the Barbarian's a simple concept in every game. Smash things, get angry about it, and spend that liquid anger on some harder smashes. This character does that and has plenty of other paths and weapon choices to choose from. Best of all, you're not limited since you can kill or be this shit and have all 4 slots occupied at once. That's so much space for legendary aspects and can really help round out a build. When I played the Barbarian, I felt initially like I could crush anything. You want to maintain this berserking and nuke anything in your path. A portion of that power did exist until the end, with certain abilities and builds. For Barbarian strengths, I think the best place to start is their AoE and single target. Their single target incidentally feels like AoE in some cases. A good example of that would be their bash or their flay. You can usually half or wholly kill trash mobs in single swings, especially with crits. Whirlwind and Hammer of the Ancient were 2 abilities that crushed entire packs, but the main event ability, in my opinion, was Death Blow. Nobody talked about this as much as I thought they would, because I found it to be the most useful ability while I played. Now, this ability is unique in that if you get a kill with it, its cooldowns instantly reset and it hits a large area. When fully leveled up, I was smashing waves of mobs with this, and I had little to no concern of resource cost and very quick results. Highly recommend this ability to anyone. It was my personal primary damage dealer 90% of the time and made playthroughs much more manageable. Barbarian's ultimates were really unique, but I typically stuck with Call of the Ancients at full upgrade. Most of the time, the summons generated enough rage that I could just sit in Whirlwind or spam hammers, and it was a gigantic DPS boost in its duration. Barbarians had a load of movement and self-support options as well, which excited me because I could only think of the possibilities of combinations to fit different build varieties. You could have a tanky one with Iron Skin and Challenging Shout, or even just a hyper movement build with Leap and Charge. Either way, I liked that they all felt viable, if not a bit mundane. For Barbarian's weak points, it's the entire early game. Barbarians feel like they're lodged in this unique position of being incredibly too strong in some cases, but utterly useless in boss and elite encounters. That juxtaposition is only evident when your resource spending is stronger than your survivability, and Barbarians spend a lot of resource. You only really gain rage while in battle, and in boss fights, after your CDs are spent, you rarely have time to sit in auto due to a variety of mechanics. This is true for both ranged and melee bosses. Both incentivize space and positioning, but I still completed everything the beta had to offer with this class. Now, they also suffer from the limited spacebar. Barbarians have so many abilities that don't need to be fully leveled to get the instant value out of it, but the picking and choosing is difficult when you're incentivized to fold 4 weapons, but really only want to build one effectively. I mentioned earlier how I wanted to build a hammer barbarian. It was frustrating when I had to use an ability that used an axe or something else because it was more effective. I had dual legendary weapons when leveling and changed my build completely, and while it was interesting, it was a bit demoralizing. So now begs the question, were they fun? And the answer is yes. Most of the time. When facing mobs that were at events or in dungeons, I could spam Killing Blow, effectively kill any and all mob with enough casts. I think the mobility and fantasy are there, and the only real time they weren't fun was being low level against bosses. I wanted to close with the fact that I think towards the end game, Barbarians are going to be nuclear Avengers level threats because they'll have access to much stronger survivability, resource generation, and legendary aspect space. I absolutely look forward to that endgame feeling of being an unstoppable force, and of course, spinning to win. Barbarians for me get a 7 out of 10. Although I'll be reviewing Druid next, I wanted to include it in this part because overall it frustrated me to no end. In the beta, the class-defining quest lines were in zones you couldn't reach for both Druid and Barbarian. This really fucking annoyed me because the 2 classes both felt impaired during the beta, and I think it was bothersome because initially they were the 2 classes I felt the strongest about maining. I'm not sure how absolutely devastating this was to their overall performance, but it felt like it played a role. Now, the Druid was the second class I leveled, and it was really incredibly frustrating to say the least. The moments that felt so amazing and really befitting to the character and class were outweighed by the just complete lack of damage. Survivability was great, and so was the class fantasy, but to truly get my point across, I'll elaborate. Looking at the class fantasy, I think Druid, as I've come to know it in a fantasy context, feels wrong here. Now, the animal shapeshifting is awesome, but I dislike that it's temporary. I wish that it were permanent upon choice, and I understand the game isn't designed that way, but it's jarring to change back and forth every few seconds. I also feel like the abilities that tie into Druid feel more shamanistic in nature, and they try to unnaturally blend the two. The mixture, which feels necessary but kills the fantasy for me personally, is completely wrong. I think Blizzard couldn't have been further off from the mark if Bobby designed this class himself. The playstyle I felt fit the Druid best was the cat form. After trying them all, it seems not only the most comfortable rotationally, but it also had some interesting play with the poison dots and survivability that worked decent and did feel like a cat. Now, I think this class isn't a complete failure, and here's why. If you consider how the class survives with their shapeshifting form gaining defensive stat bonuses and the pets they're offered, you can maintain yourself in even tough melee boss battles with very little panic. Second, but nearly first best feature about the Druid comes with a legendary aspect, Printed, where your wolves become werewolves that deal 160 additional damage and they spread a poison dot for you. Now, these wolves would not only hold aggro, but were targetable to do a lunging strike, which actually did a decent chunk of damage. Additionally, the abilities felt strong together. For the casting abilities, I did like utilizing the wind the most. The range felt good and the resource upkeep wasn't overly demanding, but your cooldowns were so harsh and the gameplay overall did not feel rewarding. The pets made it feel easier to keep a distance, and I didn't mind this playstyle all that much. At heart though, I do prefer melee. So in comes the cat form, which in my opinion was Druid's saving grace. The poison spec abilities felt really strong, and paired with the survivability, I was able to apply it and keep running as the enemies behind me died to a mixture of my dots and my werewolves. Most bosses focused on them, and the cat form generated resources and spent them at an almost equal rate. I never strived for more or had an ability I didn't care to use. That said, even with those amazing benefits, it still lacked damage, a hamartia. You see, because of the lack of damage, elite fights would take forever, and boss fights, including the main story ones, felt really awful. Really awful. You were left potionless and running in circles casting what you could while your pets slowly chipped away, waiting for another health potion drop so you could pop CDs a few more times, and it really sucked. A bear form was a slow and heavy hitter that still felt incapacitated, and honestly, it just felt like they were worried about some form of scaling internally, panicked, and made everything in their kit just not great. Again, I couldn't do their class quests, so who knows? Were they fun? Absolutely. The wolf pack of myself and my two werewolves was a blast to play. The poison spreading and ripping around like an actual werewolf was a great feeling, and the abilities all felt really unique for overdone RPG tropes, if only they did damage. Overall, I'd give Druids a 3 out of 10, but that's an overall and a score that I think purely reflects the beta and has no real imprint on my feelings post-launch. That'll be a different conversation. However, I did think of this build that involved using some pylons. All Hail Hydra. Now, this class was interesting to me because I generally hate casters of all types in RPGs. From D&D to WoW, they just never appealed to me in any representative way. I don't know if it was just the fact that I played them after leveling those two melee classes, but Sorcerer was a fresh breath when I got to play it, and here's why. Beginning with the class Fantasy, we're immediately given exactly what we'd expect at the mage's proverbial dinner table. We have ice, fire, and who could forget lightning. The class plays exactly like you'd imagine, but the twists as you level are absolutely refreshing and a cool way to change what you'd expect out of the normal mage and caster type. I particularly was interested in fire off the bat for no reason other than the place you start seemed cold. I stuck with this choice when I saw the visual for Incinerate. That ability chained after a fireball felt so satisfying, I was convinced I'd follow that path until the endgame. I didn't know that I'd stumble into what is potentially one of the best skills of the beta, Hydra. Summoning as a mage is less common and even less expected for them to be unstoppable. All memes aside, Hydra was an ability that immediately simplified content and was really impactful in the overall feel of the build. But to get back on track, I'd say Sorcerer had one of the most expected yet unexpected feelings, and definitely hits the fantasy. For the strong parts of the Sorcerer, it might be easier to say them all, but when you dive a little deeper, it's actually a bit more specific, really specific. They have noteworthy abilities that stand out above all in each category, and don't necessarily have to benefit from a build to be useful. Good examples are like the resource generator Arclash, who's really useful in dungeons and mob kills, and surprisingly overshown by a lot of the other choices. Then you have the teleport when you get to the defensive abilities, which was another contender for the best ability in the beta. It sent you flying across the map with a relatively low cooldown, and it was my best form of mobility for the entire beta on every character. Another great feature was the way that builds, even when using subpar abilities, felt good when they synergized. Throwing up a firewall, then a Hydra, then holding Incinerate while enemies burned 3 ways to Mars trying to make it to me was refreshing and cool, and I think the other variations definitely felt similar. All of their ultimate skills were cool in their own unique way, and the enchantment system only made each thematic build feel more empowered. It allows for such a range of variability in the way that it could be played. Although there's not much that goes negative Negatively against Sorcerer, I would say I personally felt like there was one thing that did stand out to me, and it was the shoehorning into abilities when taking on competitive content. If you were in a dungeon, you could kind of mindlessly run around with Hydra or an electric build flying through, but when you got to elites or a boss and actually had to sit up, you realized there were only really 1 or 2 spells doing the work. That felt bad, but this could be a beta point that will be alleviated with the variety that's allowed when you can hit max level. Are they fun to play? Kind of. Honestly, that's a personal opinion and more than enough said. I might be biased having played this class after the 2 arguably worst classes of the beta, but I genuinely think Sorcerer is great and bland. It's cool to be strong and all, but when your entire gameplay is simple and strong, it doesn't feel like I've worked to hit high numbers. Not a class that's all for me from a fun standpoint. If you're min-maxing off rip when the game releases, I think this is the perfect option for you. Overall, I'd rate mages an 8.5 out of 10. Rogue feels disingenuous to me if I truly dig too deeply on it, since I was only able to get it to level 21. But I want to explain a bit of why that's the case and talk about what I felt it did well and what I felt it didn't do well more than anything. But that needs some context. First and foremost, Rogue was actually the last character that I played on the beta, and I only got to play it really the last extra day of the beta. It was supposed to close on, I think, the 26th, and it closed on the 27th. Now, the Rogue was an awesome class when I did get to try it. I did not get to experience the full legendary aspect feeling, and I really think that I missed out on some of the way that this plays. Now, when asking if Rogue hits the class fantasy, I'd have to give it a resounding yes and no. Again, we're talking 21 levels of 100 and a very narrow beta test, but you must consider that I'm more talking about, did I feel like a rogue when playing Rogue? And that answer more often than not was no. Now, I played the Rogue initially as a melee intended rogue, running what would be expected of it, using Invigorating Strike, Poison Imbuement, and Flurry. The movement with dash was great, and I really got the sense of being a high-fly melee madman who was hellbent on gotta go fast. This dealt respectable damage, but felt more like a wasp than a swordsman. It leapt around dealing damage, disengaging, and re-engaging. This felt bad as once you were swarmed with mobs, limiting movement, or were faced with a tough single target, it was just less savvy. Then I switched to the ranger variation of the Rogue, utilizing a bow I got that's legendary ability was to volley for free at locations that I'd used my arrows at. I quickly found enjoyment with a combination of forceful arrow, penetrating shot, and poison imbuement. The penetrating shot, fully leveled and imbued with poison, would half health an elite in one shot and really hurt a boss. This with caltropes allowed me to stay mostly always safe and slinging arrows unimpeded. This didn't feel faithful to Rogue, but it was awfully interesting at the beginning. That did fade, however, and both playstyles ended up feeling like a faster and less powerful version of already existing playstyles. Thankfully, neither were comparable to Druid in any way. The positives of playing a Rogue was the stimulation and momentum of playing it. You were everywhere all at once and dealing once again pretty respectable damage. They also have a ton of variety with their survivability and attack options. Tons of AoE, tons of single target, slows, poison, chills, dots, and 1,000,001 ways to dash around. The Ranger did unbelievable single target damage and felt just as if not more viable than the fast pedaling Rogue who flies haphazardly around. It allows the breathing room needed to regain resource and kept a flow of damage going, but something still felt missing. See, I mentioned that it was a class that felt like a slightly lesser version of itself. It could get in and around the melee range like a barbarian, but hit less hard. It could hit really far range and powerful attacks, but without a summons of sorts to help with the distance, you'd have to move more than you'd ideally like to while gaining resource. On top of that, it also gave the impression that a lot of the damage is going to come from just 1 or 2 things forever, and that everything else is supplementary, as there were no shortages of add-ons to the class along the ability tree. Regarding its level of fun to play, I'd have to say that it honestly felt pretty bland. Both specs felt like they were accomplishing the same thing as everyone else, while moving faster, but with slower results. We're evolving just backwards. I had minimal fun with this class, and I don't see myself returning to it even after release. Overall, I would still rate the Rogue a 7 out of 10. Well, what can I say? I saved my personal favorite in the class that I'll be picking on release for last. Necromancer was in my opinion the class that, while feeling the most complicated, gave the funnest build variety. Each one felt viable and powerful. It's my favorite class of them all by far, and I don't want to wait another second to tell you why. If you want class fantasy, look no further than the Necromancer. Beginning at the baseline level, you get 4 skeletons that feel immortal even on veteran, and that's entire purpose of living is to fuck shit up for you. The skeletons get so many varieties over the leveling process, and you get to mix and match different kinds and play the role of somebody who's really running an army of attendees. Now they will kite, tank, and do anything that you need in battle. The ability paths all feel really awesome as well. A shadow path that leads you to do dot damage as well as a soul drain, a bloody tank type build that's really difficult to kill, a bone build that weakens enemies and stabs them with very powerful abilities even at rank 1, and they can all be intermingled and mixed to create a devastating build, all completely devoid of your skeletons, not impeding them or that area at all. Class Fantasy gets 100 million billion trillion thousand from me. Necromancer feels all like goods, but there are some bads, and we'll get to those in a moment. Starting with the things that felt strong though, you'd be hard-pressed to find an ability that wasn't strong in its own right. The Skeletal Warriors, Mages, and Golem itself are absolute abominations of pure power that could win most fights without you casting. It's definitely overscaled and overtuned, but it felt amazing while roaming and being surrounded. You can even sacrifice some of them to gain bonuses that make you a scarier one-man army. The abilities all do so much damage and work together so well that I found myself using Blight Orbs to begin, get my skeletons involved, only to switch to Decompose while my army advanced, and that more than won most fights. I found an incredible build that I'll show briefly here. It involved the Blood Burst ability. I won't go into details just yet, but as you can see, it spared no victim, and I'm sure you can work it out. I'm going to be making a video about that build and the other builds that I ran during the beta shortly thereafter. One thing you'll immediately notice is that they have next to no mobility, and I don't blame them. Most armies stick together, and skeletons are slow walkers. That aside, if you were to push world first, this is probably not the class. Another issue with them is the screen clutter. So many minions under you and so many mobs that look like them, it's easy to get confused on the screen, and I'd often cast my own minions because they just blended in that well to some scenes. I also think that Necromancer builds don't all seem late game viable. It seems like somebody who played football in high school but works at a 7-Eleven when they're 50. Now, were they fun or not should be out of the question, but if not, look at this one more time. Exactly. Necromancers are one of, if not the funnest class in Diablo, and I wholly expect to play it on release. Necromancers get a 9 out of 10 for me overall, and I don't think that needs further elaboration. To summarize all my thoughts, I went from someone who never really even touched an ARPG to being a near servitude to the game during its beta. I convinced friends to buy the deluxe version so we could play it before it fully releases. Hell, I don't even like chicken and I'm double stacking. Diablo did something really special in its beta in giving me a gaming experience I didn't know existed, but one that I needed. I think it's obvious that Blizzard's put a lot of time into this game, and I can't say it's flawless because the beta was filled with server issues, bugs, class imbalance, repeated dungeons, and a lot of struggle. But that was so outweighed by the game's presence of mind, I can't wait for the full release. If you'd like detailed introspection on any of the classes that I played and my thoughts, or any specific things that you'd like my opinion on, let me know, leave a comment, and I'll be trying to respond to some of them in short form or just in comment. Thank you guys for watching, and until next time, see ya.